You're listening to the Table Talk podcast, brought to you by the team at Food Matters. Welcome to the Table Talk podcast, brought to you by Food Matters. In these podcasts, we explore a huge range of crucial issues and exciting developments in the food industry with brilliant guests drawn from all areas of expertise. I'm Stefan Gates. I'm a TV presenter and writer, and I specialise in food and science. Now, today's podcast is an exploration into the loss of taste and smell in COVID-19 sufferers and how this relates to people's experience of food now, but also in the future. Joining us to discuss this is the fantastic Professor Barry Smith from the Institute of Advanced Studies, University of London. Barry, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, a pleasure to join you, Stefan.
Now, you are, I believe, the UK lead for the Global Consortium for Chemosensory Research, and you're doing a study on the impact of loss of sense and taste in COVID-19 sufferers. Before we start delving into that, just tell us a little bit about your background and your role in the study.
Well, I am someone who has studied taste and smell, and working with psychologists and neuroscientists, we've been very interested in multisensory perception of flavor. So that's something I know that you and your listeners are very interested in. So you can't be interested in how we get our flavor experiences without paying a lot of attention to the sense of smell. We know how terribly important that is to constituting those meaty, fruity flavors that just disappear if you're reduced to what the tongue gives you, which is salt, sweet, sour, bitter, savory. So the smell research community is actually rather small. I mean, if you compare it to people in neuroscience working on vision, which is huge, smell is this tiny corner, and it hasn't always had very much attention. And then imagine the surprise when sometime in February and March, we started to hear lots of reports of people suddenly losing their sense of smell and taste. And this was being reported as the COVID outbreak was happening, and the reports of smell loss were tracking the disease. So we heard reports coming out of China, then Iran, that moved to Italy, Germany, France, the UK, the US. And what we noticed was something very different and unusual, and that is that people were reporting a sudden loss of smell, and it was often without any nasal blockages. I mean, people know if they have a cold or a flu, they often feel very bunged up, and they say, well, I can't smell very much. And unfortunately, some of them with a flu virus will go on to develop post-viral infection and repeated loss of smell. However, this was the sudden loss of smell, no other signs. And what we now know is that loss of taste and smell were the earliest and the most prevalent symptoms of COVID-19, and that very often people who were otherwise asymptomatic, they didn't know the virus, had developed this condition. And that's when chemosensory researchers around the world got together, started the GCCR, the Global Consortium of Chemosensory Research, 600 odd people from 40 countries. And I was the UK lead, and working with ear, nose and throat clinicians, working with smell loss patient groups, and working with sensory scientists, we were trying to campaign furiously with the government and with Public Health England to have loss of smell recognized as an official symptom. Because you remember, Stefan, that for a long time, people were reporting having a loss of smell. Even Matt Hancock was on one of the daily briefings of the political reporting of COVID-19, standing there with a scientific medical officer saying, well, I had loss of smell when I had COVID-19, and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, the man of the metaphor, Jonathan Van Tam, said, not significant, not important. That's not something we should really pay any attention to. How wrong he was, because we reckon now about 65% of those who have COVID-19 suffered loss of smell, and sadly about 15% of them will continue with a loss of smell.
Okay, well, let's dive into this a little bit. Do we have any idea why this happens?
Science has ramped up considerably, and that's why, in a way, it's a very invigorating time for those of us who work on smell, because there's tremendous effort to find out what the mechanisms are. We don't know exactly, but this is what we know. We know the coronavirus binds to these cells, ACE2 cells, that they lock onto them, and that we've got ACE2 cells in the nose. Now, strangely enough, they're not in olfactory receptors. So there isn't a direct attack on your olfactory sensing system. But there are supporting cells in the olfactory epithelium in the nose and in the nasal cleft at the top of the nose. There are these supporting cells, sustencular cells, and they are important to enable you to smell. And it's these ones that seem to get infected because that's where the ACE2 cells are. Now, a lot of people who had infection there, they have inflammation that blocks off the route to getting molecules to the receptors. So it's a sort of, it doesn't block your breathing, so you don't feel bunged up, but it does actually occlude the ability for the odors to reach those olfactory cells. Now, if people's inflammation died down, a lot of people will have in 2 weeks of pretty nasty symptoms of COVID-19, they often recover the sense of smell. But for those whose inflammation remained high and the body was still fighting, there would be these cytokine storms and you would get splashback, and that seemed to be damaging and sometimes destroying olfactory receptors. And that's where you saw longer term loss of smell. But the nose is a terribly important infection site. And, I want to say this because we're not out of the woods yet as we're recording this podcast. That's why I'm a keen advocate of wearing masks. Given that I know the nose is a really dangerous infection site, given I know it leads you to risk of loss of smell for the longer term, wear a mask, cover that nose.
Now, am I right in thinking that we still aren't entirely clear on the mechanism by which a flavor volatile will create the smell sensation, or is there now consensus on how the mechanism works?
We know an awful lot about smell, but still a lot to learn. I mean, smell is still more mysterious than taste. We know what the basic tastes are. We know this salt, sweet, sour, bitter, umami. And we also know that there are dedicated receptors for those. In the case of smell, things are a little more complicated and still not entirely tractable. You've got broadly tuned receptors, olfactory receptors that will respond to many odors, and then you've got some others that are more specific that will respond to only some odors. But for every single odor molecule that can be detected, many receptors will identify that molecule or be required for identifying that molecule. And equally, for any of those receptors, they'll also participate in identifying other odor molecules, other smells. So there's no clear way of saying how the coding works. Yeah. But we know that without that sense of smell, you're not going to get fruit flavors, meaty flavors. Coffee will suddenly become what it really is without its aroma, which is hot water with a bitter taste. Yeah. So you need
my idea of hell.
Yeah, absolutely, my idea of hell.
And has this the research that you've been doing into the effects of COVID-19 helped with understanding the mechanism anymore, or are things still a little bit opaque?
Well, it's crucially important that we get very reliable information from sufferers and from patients. I mean, interestingly, lots of hypotheses come up about what the mechanism is, and that's where getting reports from patients who tell us what the course of their experience and loss and sometimes recovery is are clues to the mechanism. So one of the things that we know, this sudden loss of smell, and especially the fact that it was happening without a blocked nose, told us, this isn't like a flu impact. It's slightly different. There's something here that's special and distinctive to COVID. Equally, the fact that we had people recovering after 14 days, the sense of smell's back. It didn't come back all at once. Quite often, colleagues of mine who had lost the sense of smell would say, "Oh, I can smell rosemary, but nothing else." Or and a day later, they'd say to me, "Oh, I can now smell mint, but I can't smell bleach if I'm cleaning kitchen surfaces."
That is amazing, isn't it?
Amazing. So there was this sort of slow recovery, bit by bit, it was coming back. And it's interesting for the rest of us to notice just how much we need to understand about smell, because, and this is the thing that I think we are learning now, is that many people lost the sense of smell, anosmia, as we've all learned to identify that.
Finally, everyone knows what the word is. Yeah.
Finally, for those of us who've been talking about this forever, and they're saying, what? Now we know anosmia. Maybe even Jonathan Van Tam now knows anosmia, enough for our 8-week campaign against him to have it recognized as a symptom. But there we are. So we had anosmia, but here's the new thing, Stefan, which is now the focus of lots of my colleagues' research, and that I'm involved in too. We're noticing that some people are recovering. The anosmia is gone. They have a period of a week or so, maybe a couple of weeks, where they say, oh, my sense of smell is back, it's fine. And then they start noticing distorted sense of smell. Mm-hmm. And this is called parosmia. Now, parosmia, we've known before. It's been seen in post-viral infections and actually seen in cases of people suffering from head injury too. So parosmia is where familiar things now smell very different, very distorted. And not only that, they smell quite disgusting.
Yeah. And this is different from phantosmia.
This is different from phantosmia. Phantosmia is where you have an experience of a smell, but there's no source. So suddenly, you'll have this chemical smell, or a smell of sort of cheesy smell, and you'll think, oh, what have I left out? Or smell of rotting garbage, and you look around and there's nothing there. So that's a hallucination, an olfactory hallucination. But parosmia is where familiar things are now experienced often in a very disgusting way. Let's go back to some of the familiar triggers for this. So coffee. A lot of people discover they're sufferers of parosmia when they have coffee, and it now is unbearable. It has that. The best description I've heard is it tastes like fruity sewage.
Oh my gosh! Yeah,
my gosh. So there's a sort of sweetness and a disgustingness in there, and they can't bear it, and they can't bear the smell of it. Certainly can't bear to taste it. And what's interesting is that. This is what leads us to new potential research avenues. Yeah. This leads us to think, so there's a mystery. Why do people seem to regain their sense of smell and then develop parosmia? That's a mystery. But in the case of parosmia, let's go back to what I said at the beginning, that we know that many receptors are involved in binding to and identifying particular odor molecules, and those receptors are involved in identifying different smells, different odor molecules. What seems to be going on in parosmia is a kind of, as your receptors grow back, there's a faulty wiring. They've been kind of connected to the wrong ports, if you like. So you're getting faulty signals. Now, that was the original view of parosmia, and people thought that's a pretty good understanding of it. However, some beautiful research coming out of a friend and collaborator of mine at the University of Reading, Jane Parker. Jane Parker has been, even before COVID, was looking at parosmia and discovering particular food groups. And there are particular chemical families that seem to be particular triggers for parosmia. Coffee is one. Roasted meats is another. So Maillard reaction, Maillard compounds that happen when we start to heat food and roast it and break down the proteins, and we get the cascade of chemical reactions that give us more and more of those lovely flavor aromas. That seems to be in there. Onions, garlic, they seem to be in there too. And so what Jane has done both before and during COVID, where she takes people into the lab. They sit down in front of a GCO. So this is gas olfactometry. You're sitting with your nose in a little cone, and this chemical machine takes a substance like coffee or a piece of roasted meat, and it allows the volatile molecules to come off at different speeds and different rates. And so all of the things in that mixture that's coffee or meat or onion come at you separately. And she's been identifying, which particular sulfur compounds are people suddenly finding unbearable, or are they noticing more? Now, mechanism, good question what that is. Two hypotheses. One hypothesis is that somehow those really disgusting things, which are in coffee, sulfur compounds are in there. So are sulfur compounds are in the Maillard reaction of aromas and flavors too. Maybe they're being boosted. Maybe we're particularly sensitive to those. The other thought is maybe we just are losing some of the other molecules and aromas that mask those flavors, that sort of dilute them and prevent us. So one thing is, imagine if we have a lot of long-term parosmia sufferers. Could we make coffee by muting or taking out or reducing some of these notes? Don't know, but that's maybe worth a try.
So this is where it becomes really fascinating, where this condition becomes an opportunity to research and understand not just smell, but also potentially the COVID-19 as well. And have you seen this? Is this a route to understanding the function of the virus itself? And is it a route to understanding a little bit more about smell and taste?
Certainly a route to understanding the virus, because this idea that it's persisting, that's persisting in the nose, or that the consequences of infection in the nose and in the ACE2 cells in the nose, that is leading to long-term damage. It makes it more likely, we think, that inflammation is one of the problems here. It's very interesting that inflammation had become a bit of a new topic in medicine even before COVID-19. People were noticing a link between inflammation and depression. People were, when the body's organs are inflamed, eventually some of that inflammation spreads to the brain when it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and then you get tremendously depressed people, because you switch off, you close down, you try to cope with that inflammatory state. We were discovering that irritable bowel syndrome, bad eating habits, and distress to the cell walls of the stomach were meaning that the bacteria, which are so good in the gut, our microbiome, that some of them were leaking out. And while they were good when digesting food, they were very bad if they got into the bloodstream and if they crossed the blood-brain barrier.
So another system of the gut-brain axis, but actually
another
slightly different.
Yeah. But a lot of this is coming from, as I say, inflammation. Now, inflammation is interesting because it's a protective mechanism. It's something which, when the body's being attacked, when there are things to defend against, then you get an inflammatory response. And with any, our immune system does that when it's attacked by a virus. But if it overacts, if you get too much inflammation, it actually does more of the damage than the virus itself does. And that looks to be the case in olfaction with COVID-19. It's not the coronavirus itself that's doing the damage. It's some of the reactions to and consequences of that, the body's defenses that are probably creating the damage. So there we're learning a little bit about mechanism. But if we look at parosmia, that's still a mystery. I mean, we've had parosmia, we've had anosmia, but we haven't seen this new course of experience, which is suffering from anosmia, returning to normal, then developing parosmia. That's a mystery. Nobody's at all sure why that happens.
And we have to be aware that we're going to be left with, I mean, if you look at it on an epidemiological sort of scale, we are going to be left with a large section of the population with do you think that there's going to be an ongoing problem? And you were saying, you gave a percentage for the amount of people who continue to have this problem. Yes.
So, we know 70 million people have been infected with COVID-19. We know 65% of those roughly have had smell disorder. And then we think of those having smell disorder, 10 to 15% will have continued smell problems, either continued loss of smell or smell dysfunction, like parosmia, phantosmia, that's many millions of the population around the world.
And there's a mental and emotional impact of these things, isn't there?
Huge. This, again, is something that I think we have learned more about from patient groups, who are terribly important, because if you talk to most medics, most GPs, they say, you've lost your sense of smell, don't worry about it, not important, the Jonathan Van Tam response. So people will say, if you go in and see your GP, they say, can you see, can you hear, can you stand up all right and keep your balance? You're fine. It doesn't matter if you've lost your sense of smell. Doesn't worry. Now we know that's absolutely not true. First of all, loss of smell tends to lead to depression. We think that's because of a direct physiological connection. So we know famously that the olfactory bulb has just 2 relays to reach the amygdala, which is a source of arousal and emotion in the brain. And there are 2-way directions. I mean, signals are sent from the olfactory bulb to the amygdala, and from the amygdala to the olfactory bulb. When signals are not coming in, you get shrinkage of the olfactory bulb, and you just are less aroused. You're not getting as much stimulation. And it's very interesting when you hear patient reports. People with loss of smell tell you, I feel cut off from my surroundings. I feel alienated in my own home. It feels strange. I feel as though that my way of experiencing the world is as if from behind glass. Now, it's only when you lose your sense of smell that you suddenly realize how much it was doing day to day, every moment of life, to give you the fabric of your everyday experience.
And warning of dangers. I mean, the impact is spectacular, isn't it?
No, it's spectacular. So several things. One, of course, not taking pleasure in your food. And that does have serious consequences. When people no longer find food interesting, it's utterly bland. They think it's tasteless, but very often it's due to loss of smell, although there are 10% of people, unlike the 65% who have had persistent taste problems with COVID. But imagine your food tastes bland. You're really interested in only salt, sweet, and sour. That's not very much. Texture you might try to get enthused about. But when you're having something that seems like utterly beige, bland food, 2 things happen. One, either people stop eating, very bad, or they start eating just those things they can get a hit out of, the very salty things, the very sweet things, and now their nutrition is very distorted. So begins a negative cycle, I guess. And that begins a negative cycle. And the other things that we forget about is intimacy. People with loss of smell talk about, their partner. They can't smell their partner. They can't have that reassuring kind of closeness that they feel. Sometimes they can't smell their children. They feel very much bereft. And a lot of people, you listen to them talking, and they tell you how emotionally awful it is to be without the sense of smell. And I think that's one of the things that the sudden uptick in cases of anosmia are doing, is that more medics are now going to hear about and understand what it means to be without your sense of smell, and be a little more sympathetic. So I'm convinced that, having moved from a chronic symptom of some people who generally got ignored and got very little medical treatment, it became an acute condition when we suddenly saw more and more people declaring loss of smell. Medics got interested, scientific research started to increase in this area. Now, if you work with patient groups, and there are 2 smell loss groups in the UK, Absent and Fifth Sense, who are both charities dealing with people with loss of smell and taste disorders, they can bring people in who give accurate reports of what it's like, what's going on, what's happened, which foods they do and don't cope with. And then, if that gets fed back to medics are more informed, but we also want the medics to give good advice to the patient groups so that people get reliable information and not crazy information. And equally, scientific researchers are informed by the patient group. So I think there's this nice triangle of medicine, patient group, and and scientific research, which is healthy and positive, and makes sure that it's good, because a lot of people who've lost the sense of smell and do feel very low and very dispirited, it helps if they think, I can participate in this research, I can contribute to it, I can be a citizen scientist, and they absolutely can. And so that's one positive thing, I think, coming out of this.
So what are the next steps in the study? What are you going to be looking at going forward?
Well, we're looking at exactly which compounds trigger, which odor compounds seem to trigger this awful response. We're also classifying, Jane Parker has been very good at classifying types of parosmia smells. So the funny thing is, people have got a few. One, they've got this fruity, unpleasant fruity smell. That's one. The other is a chemical smell. Imagine like a solvent or a medicine bottle hospital smell. That's another. And then here's a strange one. And again, this is just a bit mind blowing, because we don't really understand this at all. Well, it turns out that lots of things you like, chocolate, coffee, roast chicken, and so on, suddenly become disgusting. Turns out that bathroom smells and the smell of a child's nappy suddenly become rather nice. They become rather kind of sweet and enjoyable. And at first it was a little bit of a guilty secret, a shameful secret. Yeah. And then on the absent patients Facebook group on parosmia, people started to say this, and then suddenly hundreds of responses came in. Yes, I've noticed this. So this is what I call the fair is foul and foul is fair part of parosmia. It's a switch around. But think, people, and the funny thing is, here's a funny thing for somebody interested in food science as you are. People are smelling their own excrement, and they're smelling it with food smells in there. They're smelling onion and coffee and all sorts of things. It's as if they're getting some of the waste products are giving them some of the food digestion, still retaining traces of food, but none of the polluting, awful, foul smells.
How extraordinary.
And think how confusing it is if your poo actually smells like food and your food actually smells like poo. This is a bad situation to find yourself in.
And so the concept of a bad rewiring that you mentioned, it really does make sense here, doesn't it? And I wonder, it does feel as though that sort of sheds light on the system a little bit more for me, where I have much lower understanding of the mechanism of the whole thing. It sort of makes sense that there are, as you say, so many different molecules that combine to form a flavor, and especially the flavors that you're talking about, coffee and chocolate and Maillard reactions. They're all very complex flavors as well. So they are combinations of lots of different molecules. So that's, I guess, where things get messy. Now, so what can we do? Is there anything that we can do to help people who are suffering from anosmia?
I think for anosmia, we can do one or two things. What's been found is that smell training is one of the best things that people can try. Now, this is something that ear, nose, and throat clinicians know about, and most GPs and other medics don't know about. So smell training is quite extraordinary. What you do is you get 4 essential oils. The classic set that people had used was lemon, clove, eucalyptus, and rose. And you smell them first thing in the morning, last thing at night. And if you're suffering from anosmia, you will be sniffing, and you'll say, this is pointless because I'm not getting anything. But we tell people, do persevere, because there's evidence that people who do smell training, as opposed to a group who don't, there's a higher incidence of people regaining the sense of smell, recovering the sense of smell.
That's extraordinary.
And I think what's happening is, even though there's no experience, everything seems muted and absent, trying to do the sniffing, you are actually encouraging the pathways to reconnect. You're trying to get the connection between those olfactory receptors in the nose, in the wet mucous membrane, connected, up to the olfactory bulb and the piriform cortex, and from the piriform cortex and olfactory bulb back down, the neural signals are going in both directions. And by just the act of sniffing that stimulus, you know I'm sniffing something called rose. You've probably got a memory of what rose smells like. You know, you're really trying to drive the pathway into its usual route and connection and get everything back to normal. So smell training does seem to work. It's also, I'll tell you an interesting fact about smell training. As we get older, as we all are, our sense of smell start to decline, just as our eyesight does and our hearing does, our senses generally. But using smell training helps you keep your sense of smell longer and keep it more acute. But it doesn't just mean that you keep your sense of smell going. It also means that you're more cognitively active. So there's a lovely study done by Thomas Hummel's group in Dresden. It's one of the sort of leading centers for olfactory research. And what they did was they had 70-year-olds, and they had one group doing Sudoku for 3 months and the other group doing smell training for 3 months. And what happens is after 3 months, the Sudoku people are better at doing Sudoku, but they're not really any more cognitively active on tests elsewhere. But the smell training group are better, more cognitively active elsewhere. So there you are. Smell training is better for you than Sudoku. So we should all be doing.
It's a beautiful thing. It's fantastic.
Isn't that fantastic? We should all be doing smell training. I mean, I think the sense of smell is a use it or lose it sense. And you find, interestingly, again, it's just correlational, but you find that wine tasters, perfumers, people using the sense of smell seem to suffer less dementia than others. And I think, again, there's a sort of interesting thing here. If you think of the elderly, what are they suffering from? Loss of memory and quite often depression. Now, we know loss of smell can lead to depression. We also know that you use your sense of smell to lay down memories of places. So your episodic memory about having gone to the bakery or knowing that you're by the sea or whatever, your sense of smell is involved in that. Now, when that goes, I think it's going to be very difficult to lay down new memories, and it's also going to leave you depressed. So I think for the aging population, we should get them all on smell training, and we should be making sure that they're remaining as active as possible. As I say, it's a use it or lose it sense.
Well, it sounds like the phone is ringing at the Institute of Advanced Studies a little bit more recently, which is great news. So, just finally, for anyone who has been suffering from loss of taste and smell and is not getting a particularly helpful response from maybe their GP or even possibly their family around them, what support is there for people?
So I would recommend that they look for Absent, and it's scent as in smell, absent.org or fifthsense.org.uk. These are both smell loss charities, and they have lots of information. And the best thing about both of these, and I work with both, best thing is that they have clinicians on board. They have ear, nose, and throat surgeons. They have smell and taste experts and scientists working with them. So patients will get both a lot of information, but they'll also get, I think, the reassurance of reading about and hearing about and talking to others going through the same thing. I mean, I find on Twitter, again and again, people describe how distressed they are with food tasting different or smelling awful. And they didn't know what was going on, and nobody was really able to tell them. And then suddenly being able to say, you're not alone. A lot of people dealing with this, come and help us with our research. They say, oh, I'm so relieved to find other people who can give me reassurance that they've got through it, or that they're undergoing this, and that's what it's like. So there is information out there. It is supported now by some of the more informed medics, and the sensory scientists are working very closely with these patient groups. And so, yeah, there is help, and I hope people will reach out.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Barry, well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really look forward to finding out how all this unfolds. It feels as though it's going to shed light on a lot more things than just the experience of COVID-19 sufferers. So I really look forward to seeing how this unfolds in the future as well.
Thank you. Happy to give you the information when we have it. And thanks for having me on so we could talk about this.
Yeah, I can't wait to have you on again. You've been listening to the Table Talk podcast brought to you by Food Matters, and you heard from Professor Barry Smith and me, Stefan Gates. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this episode, you might like one of our other podcasts in which we explore pretty much every aspect of the food industry, from salmon farm sustainability to apprenticeships. Subscribe to get every episode freshly delivered to you on Apple, Spotify, Google, or your preferred podcasting platform. And to find out more, take a look at foodmatters.co.uk. Goodbye. You've been listening to the Table Talk podcast brought to you by Food Matters. Subscribe to get every episode freshly delivered on Apple, Spotify, Google, or your preferred podcasting platform. And to find out more, please visit foodmatters.co.uk.